Good evening, everyone. My name is Regina Wiltron Bengoa. I'm the Programs and Operations Director at the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute. For those of you that don't know us and that are actually tuning in for the first time, the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute is a 45-year organization that we actually focus our work in advancing cultural equity, racial and social justice for the community of the African diaspora. Tonight, we will actually be talking about a pretty difficult topic, and it's difficult because we will be unpacking the ramifications of the relationship between tourism, colonialism, and racism, right? This is a conversation that's pretty well documented in the African diaspora by intellectuals, cultural workers, artists, but it's different when we actually need to look inwards, right? We need to look inwards about what's our role as citizens of the African diaspora when we navigate other places of the African diaspora. How do we behave? How do we actually show ourselves as member of one African diaspora? At the same time that we actually have to deal with racial profiling, the media, and antagonistic conversations that could also take place. When we decided to move forward with this program, there was no other person, no better person that I could think of to actually help us navigate this conversation than Dash Harris, right? Dash is a multimedia producer, doula, consultant, and entrepreneur based in Panama. She is the co-founder of AfroLatino Travel, producer of Negro, a docuseries about Latino identity, exploring Afro-diasporic and Black identity and the historical present days class, race, and color complex among Latinx. She's also a co-producer of podcasts like Bombay Afro Stories, centering Black Latin American history that ties in with the contemporary and Radio Caña Negra, dissecting themes of Black history, life, anti-Blackness, social access, justice, love, and joy throughout the Americas, and offering trainings. She also offers trainings, workshop series, and coaching on dismantling anti-Blackness and Latinx community. With no further ado, I want to introduce Dash, who will definitely help us to unpack this in a very meaningful and transcendental way that we hope that really just brings us to a place of solidarity that is actually what should be existing in all this church, because since we all share the same stories as members of this African diaspora. Thank you, Dash.
Should have known to do that already. Thank you, Regina. I'm joining you all. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm joining you all from Panama City, Panama, in this timely and ongoing conversation of unpacking tourism, colonialism, and racism within our diaspora. And we have a wonderful panel of activists, writers, change makers, resistance, diasporic folks that are joining us tonight. The first one is Bárbara Abadía-Rexach, who is a Black Puerto Rican, Afro-feminist, journalist, and sociocultural anthropologist and assistant professor at San Francisco State University, Latine Studies Department. Thank you for joining us, Bárbara. Our next panelist is a person that I actually work with on AfroLatino Travel. And this is, hold on one second. And this is Javier Wallace. He's a researcher, Ph.D. candidate at the University of Texas, avid world traveler, and co-founder of AfroLatino Travel and Black Austin Tours. Hold on one sec, I have to mute one sec. Sorry about that. That was actually my grandmother. She calls me every so often to make sure I'm taking my vitamins. So moving on, and that's real. That's what it is here. The COVID rates in Panama are pretty startling. And so this is real life. Our next panelist is Jade Similton. She's a graduate student at Michigan State University. She's a Black liberation researcher, assistant editor with the Electronic Maroonage. Thank you for joining us, Jada. Thank you for joining us, Javier. And that's exactly what I want to get into. Jada actually wrote an article about kinship when she went to Puerto Rico, right? And the quote that jumped out to me, and we'll show the quote on the slide that we have here. The quote that really jumped out to me, and we'll get to that, but I want to mention Kinship is dynamic, and more importantly, it is decisive. We asserted our relation, and our assertion is all that it needs to exist. And so Jada talks about kinship through the African diaspora. And here we have a visual of some of the headlines, some of the happenings that have been occurring throughout the year. The biggest excerpt here is on Puerto Rico and how it's cracking down on tourists flouting pandemic rules. Bárbara also wrote an article addressing that. And I just want to give a minute so everyone can get to read some of the headlines here, because this was intentional in selecting the headlines, and specifically for Black people, specifically for African descendants in our various countries. COVID-19 in Panama, there's a very high level. And when we talk about access to medical facilities, access to vaccines, I just got off of a meeting, an emergency meeting actually, with the organization Afro-Resistance, how they were talking about people's access to vaccines, how long it will take for people to get even 70% of the population of various countries in the Americas, how long it will take to get 70% of the population vaccinated. In places like Bolivia, it'll take over 3 years. In places like Panama, it'll take over 2 years for 70% of the population to get vaccinated. And this was coming from, again, the organization Afro-Resistance, led by Javier Williams-Comrie. And so I'd like to ask specifically, Bárbara, because you're Puerto Rican, you live in Puerto Rico, you wrote this article talking about the current events happening on the island entitled Tourism, Racism, and Colonialism. A specific quote from that article was talking about the government institutions on the island, such as the Department of Health, the tourism company, which have failed to establish health and safety protocols that safeguard the island population, since the government does not have the power to control the entry of tourists through airports and seaports. And the thing I want to point out is that the airport in Puerto Rico was never shut down. It had never closed down during this pandemic at all. And I want to draw attention to basically state abandonment. Because you said it's convenient for the state to wash its hands. And really they're leaving it up to the general population to kind of deal with those consequences. How has that been for you? Because you speak about your personal experience as well as the experience of your friends, and also how you feel the anti-Blackness and how news stories are portrayed of visitors to the island, Black visitors versus white visitors.
Thank you for the invitation. Good evening to everybody. Dash, what you are saying is so important. And I think that to unpack contemporary tourism in Puerto Rico, we need to talk about colonialism and racism. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States in 1898. And prior to that, we were a colony of Spain. So we don't know any other political status or situation other than being a colony. So I'm living right now in Florida, but I was in Puerto Rico the whole beginning of the pandemic until December. And tourism in Puerto Rico is something historic, you know. People are traveling to Puerto Rico for a long time. But the thing that I saw or I noticed today that is like the surprise for people is the amount of Black or African American people traveling to Puerto Rico. So now you can add this, well, not now because I'm a Black Puerto Rican, and when I am at the touristic areas in Puerto Rico, people talk me in English because they think that I am African American or somebody from the islands, as we call in Puerto Rico. So it's very important to think about how other people think about us in Puerto Rico. And this is where colonialism is there, because people are traveling to Puerto Rico because the airport wasn't shut down, was never shut down. And people can, with the passport or even without the passport, if you're a US citizen, you can travel to Puerto Rico. And the prices of the tickets drop. Surprisingly, they drop a lot. So there's a lot of people that maybe they can travel before, And now they can travel to Puerto Rico because it's cheap to go to Puerto Rico. And they are, doesn't taking care of the using the mask or the social distance. And that put us in risk also for Black people like me. If we are walking through touristic areas and people think that we are African Americans and they are targeted at them and they are mimicking them and they are making fun of the bodies or the wigs and everything. So then we can add the racism, how racism operates in Puerto Rico within the tourism context. So this is just a case of what is happening. So there's a lot of people traveling to Puerto Rico. There are a lot of people drinking alcohol and having fun. And this is normal. But during the pandemic, that put us in risk because we don't have the same health system that people have in the United States.
Right, and you bring up the concepts of the layers to the colonialism, the anti-Blackness, the racism. And I mean, I mentioned anti-Blackness, and I want to be very specific when I talk about this, because it is specifically Black communities that are in more precarious situations, whether it is access to medical services, whether, and again, Black communities, these communities that people love to go to, these paradise off the grid areas, that's where actual Black people live. And they have to traverse and negotiate the landscape, because if someone gets sick, the pathway or the access to medical centers is a bit more challenging. And so what happens when the people that are traveling and pretty much, it can be said, spreading COVID look like the locals? And so this is where I want to ask Jada about also your amazing article, just like Bárbara's, about kinship. Your article is entitled "A Radical Love Politic: What Visiting Puerto Rico Taught Me About Kinship." And what does kinship look like when you have, in this time, especially and specifically, where we had protests, Black Lives Matter, Las Vidas Negras Importan, throughout the region? What does solidarity look like? Because at the same time that you had Black Latin Americans demanding justice for the extrajudicial killings of Black North Americans, they were also saying it alongside Black Latin Americans who were also killed by state-sanctioned violence. And so Black Lives Matter, but where?
Yeah. I think the question of Black Lives Matter and where, I think it's going to require a frank conversation about the ways that African Americans are conditioned to think about themselves and to think about the places around us. I did not learn the term diaspora until I was a junior in college, and so I am like, and that one term like changed my entire life, my entire way of thinking, right? Because we are at a point where I think slavery is so far from our cultural memory. So we think of ourselves as naturalized citizens to this place, which allows for a certain erasure of indigeneity, an erasure of the transatlantic slave trade, an erasure of the ways that we are connected to other Black peoples in the Caribbean. And so I think that in thinking of the question of Black Lives Matter requires us, it's really complicated, right? So when we're talking about this conversation of layers that you mentioned earlier, there are layers here in the States that we have to deal with, where we have access to privileges more than people around us, but there is still hierarchy within the States, right? So there is. And so within the Black Lives Matter movement, right, in the sort of mainland, there is hierarchy within that as well. Like there are, when we're saying Black Lives Matter, the very founders themselves are like under attack by very masculine men who think masculine things and are saying Black Lives Matter is basically trying to destroy the nuclear family and et cetera, et cetera. So there is a layered conversation if we're thinking about Black Lives Matter and where it's like, even within the states, there is a certain level of who lives matter. So like gay people, non-normative people in general are very much so left out of this movement right here in the States. And so thinking about the fact that I literally learned the term diaspora as a junior in college, and also thinking about the fact that I come from a working class ancestry. I'm literally like a descendant of sharecroppers from Alabama. And so a lot of the people that I know don't have even a college education to even learn a term like diaspora. So the question, so that question I feel is so layered and so complicated, and requires us to literally think about the ways that we are conditioned from like children in elementary on up, to think of ourselves as naturalized in this order that is very, very oppressive to, it's an empire, right? Imperialism, colonialism, etc. To think of ourselves as naturalized in this order and to think of this order as okay is basically what we're taught from a very, very young age. And so it's a lot of dismantling and unlearning that has to be done. And I think I was only able to do it because I got a college education. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I feel that it's a start for thinking about the ways that African Americans think about themselves as being a part of this colonial structure that basically just gets us to buy into it, right? Like gets us to buy into the way that it works. So I don't know if that answers.
No, it's all relevant, right? We're not going to walk away with definitive answers to these ongoing colonial projects, imperialistic projects, so on and so forth, as we forge forward through, to Black liberation and just futures. I want to bring up the slide of what I was mentioning about the Black Lives Matters protests within the region. In the next one, I believe it is, or the next one, I'm sorry. Here we have, in each of these pictures, you have people who went to the streets, who were organizing. You have the top, where it says all lives can't matter until Black Lives Matter. That is in Spain. I had a friend that went to a protest that uploaded that picture. The next picture is in El Salvador. The next is in Honduras, highlighting the Garifuna leaders that were kidnapped, and we still don't know their whereabouts. And all of this during this pandemic, ongoing pandemic. The next picture is in Puerto Rico. The next one is in Colombia. And zooming out at the bottom, you have Brazil, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia again. And so, as I mentioned, on these signs, you see the solidarity with Black North Americans who have been extrajudiciously killed. And really, this is state-sanctioned violence, and this is in many ways encouraged by the states. And as I mentioned, you have the North American names, you have the names of people who were also murdered by state-sanctioned violence in Colombia, in Puerto Rico, in Honduras, in Costa Rica, so on and so forth. I want to point out a quote, and this will get me to what I want to ask you, Javier. One of my favorite writers on the face of the earth, Jamaica Kincaid, who says that every native of every place is a potential tourist, and every tourist is a native of somewhere. Every native would like to find a way out. Every native would like a rest. Every native would like a tour. But most natives in the world cannot go anywhere. They are too poor. And so, in thinking about, because I've actually had people that I love and respect message me, hey, I'm going to Puerto Rico. Do you have any recommendations? And I'm like, my recommendation is to stay home. And I said it like that, but it's not anything to laugh about. It's not anything to jest about. Because we are talking about people who understandably, and we can say this for anybody and everybody who wants to take a break, who wants to get away. But a lot of us within our diaspora cannot get away. So Javier, I know you're co-founder of AfroLatino Travel. you're also founder of Black Austin Tours. How has your tours pivoted during this time?
Yes, thank you for the question and good evening, everybody. How have I pivoted during this time with both AfroLatino Travel and Black Austin Tours? Well, immediately, everything that was in person completely just stopped. It paused across the board in both areas. And not immediately, but after some good time thinking across the board is like, how can it was important to say that AfroLatino Travel and Black Austin Tours, and, you know, if you ever come on a tour with me in any of those spaces, like, you know, what I'm always going to tell everybody is you come here to learn. Like, you might have some fun, and I hope you do, because you're paying your money to have fun. Cool. That's what you want to do. But you're also coming here to learn. Learn about who you are in relation to this place, who this place is in relation to you, and in relation to the broader diaspora and all of the spaces that I engage with. So it was almost, you know, when you come on tours with us, you in class. You don't even know it. You know, you might not even know it, but you in class. So it became almost a natural step to then transfer these experiences to a virtual platform and provide a very similar experience what it would be in person in a virtual space. Because at the end of the day, what the work that we do in AfroLatino Travel and the work in Black Austin Tours, it's the centering of Black history experiences and contributions. Better if it could be in the actual locale, but that doesn't mean it's nonetheless important. The importance is nonetheless, you know what I'm trying to say there. It's still important if we're not in the actual space. And that's what I did with Black Austin Tours. That's what we do with AfroLatino Travel. I have Black Austin virtual tours. We have some awesome experiences in AfroLatino Travel, leaning on our partnerships that we have formed over time with people in these localized spaces, like Mama Ari, who is on the Caribbean coast of Panama and Puerto. That has a long colonial history, but a longer history of African presence there in that space, and inviting her to lead a workshop with guests about muñecas negras, or Black dolls, and what did that mean? And that was amazing. And then additionally, working with Maria Miranda from Palenques de San Basilio, now located in Cartagena, Colombia, with cocadas, and really, and, you know, having people think about not what you're eating. It's good, right? We get that. But what is the significance of that historically, contemporarily, and like, what does that mean to the larger diaspora? And what can we take away from this experience cooking with this woman, a Black Colombian woman, and letting her tell her story and letting her allow you into her space so you can see what does this mean? And I think a lot of people take a lot of Black people particularly, a lot of things like, this is like cooking with my grandmother, you know, kind of Jada's point, like this is like cooking with my grandmother somewhere in Alabama. You know, she's talking about put a chorrito, and you trying to figure out how much is a chorrito. You know, it's like your grandma say put a splash. How much is that? So we did that. That's what we did. We went to the virtual space.
Thank you for that. And I want to bring up the slide that has your questions, because you asked one of those questions about understanding or asking who or what people were here before me, who made it possible for me to enjoy this space, and specifically, what are the local lives of Black people here? The other two, am I supporting Black businesses, and am I hiring Black tour guides and vendors? And as you see, these are screenshots of the articles that I mentioned for Bárbara and Jada. And I really, and you know, in full disclosure, I work with Javier on AfroLatino Travel, and we have not, since March 11th, I remember March 11th, I flew back into Panama, and a couple of days later, we were under lockdown, period, with the T. And I'm still living my life as if I'm on lockdown. I still, you know, I've seen my grandmother, for example. She lives in another province a couple times in a span of a year. I have not seen my partner who lives in Cuba. I have not seen him in 15 months. And so I'm still adhering to those rules, or rather they're my personal rules. It doesn't matter what the government is saying, because we already know and understand they don't really care about us. And like Bárbara pointed out in her article, it's a lot of government abandonment, which is very familiar territory when we're talking about African descendants who have historically, our communities have historically and ongoingly continue to be abandoned by the states. And I want to pull that slide back up specifically to show this quote from Marco Ramirez at the top about clean water. That clean water that exists is meant for cooking and drinking. Hand washing is a luxury. Social distancing is also complicated because most of us have informal jobs that earn daily wages. People in these communities have to decide between staying safe from the disease or having food to eat. And this is actually a friend of mine. He works with Ashanti Peru, and his organization, the organization that he works with, actually went around to Afro-Peruvian communities in Lima to give out hygiene kits, because this is the reality that the access is just not there, whether it's blocked intentionally, like I say, because there's just no way. It's just a coincidence that all of these African descended communities just coincidentally don't have access to fair housing, equitable job employment, and medical access. And so can we just zoom it back out again? And so I want to really harp on questions to ask oneself in general. And this is specifically one that Regina had brought up to me about there's some travel that one must do to take care of family business or to even caretake, because I've had a couple friends come to Panama to caretake for their families. And so what is the responsibility and what are the questions we should be asking ourselves during this time? And this is for anyone who wants to jump in, because it's a question for all of us, essentially. You know I'm gonna pick you, Javier.
I mean, it's a great question, right? And I think we know it's a pretty simple response. I believe it's a pretty simple response, right? It's kind of like you mentioned, stay at home. You know, like, is it this, like, do you really have to get away right now, like you say you want to do? And it's not going to say I understand where they're coming from, but I think it's one thing that's very unique here in the United States, particularly thinking about African Americans, and kind of Jada alluded to it. And I work with international education and study abroad with young people on campuses in the United States. And we mostly focus on underrepresented groups. And a large portion of these are Black young people, Black students from the United States. And the nuances, the hierarchy, you know, it is a privilege that has been denied, and it's not been accessible for so long for African Americans to travel beyond their borders, and especially outside the country, that, you know, we really instill in them that this is something that you have to do. It's something that you need to do because it's going to enhance you as a person. And then, of course, it's going to make you more marketable on the market, which I don't like that term, on the market. And I think, you know, and many of them go abroad and they say they experience this freedom that they never had before as a person, a Black person living in the United States. And it's like when you see everybody else doing it around you, everybody who you like, you know, as a Black person, it's like, I want to do that because I should be able to do that because I'm a human being. I'm a citizen of the United States, just like anybody else is. And it's my right. If they can do it, I can do it too. And I think that plays a large part in it. And I think we have to really deal with that part as well. It's difficult, but I tell people that if you can stay at home. And like, we have to find a way to work through that. But I think that's a very important piece to talk about, it just because We can't. And then what is that when you have that Navy blue passport from the United States or the global North, where you can access these different spaces? You have to also understand, you know, you kind of accessing a little bit of whiteness, you know, and sometimes I heard a woman say, and this was verbatim, she said, I went to Kenya, and because I was American, they told me that I could come through this special line and I didn't have to wait. She said, I never experienced that in the United States before, so you better believe it, I did it. And, you know, I'm like, you should have, you know, I'm like, you should have done that too. I would have did it too. But I think what's missed is what happened to the people in line and why were you allowed to go and they weren't? But we get so caught up in experiencing that privilege, sometimes for the first times in our lives, having this privilege, that it blinds us to the realities of people that are in our same communities. And if we don't have anybody pushing us to challenge those notions, it's so easy for us just to come have fun because everybody's doing it. Puerto Rico's open. Costa Rica's open. If they didn't want us to come, they would have closed the door. You know, it's like if they can, we can. So I think that's something that has to be taken in consideration. But the question is it really going to hurt you if you stay at home another year, another day?
And is it worth it? You know, at what cost? At what cost? When we're talking about collective work, is it really worth it for for our siblings in Puerto Rico, for example, to be suffering triple, quadruple, because it's not even double at this point. We're talking about quadruple and sixfold and tenfold at this point. And I wanna throw that segue to you, Bárbara, because you've seen it firsthand. You've experienced it firsthand. That Puerto Rico is open, folks are coming, they're living their best life, I guess. And it's kind of like a lot of alternate realities happening at the same time, and it's very bizarre. You know, I'll be honest, it's very bizarre, and it's kind of hurtful in many ways.
Yes, it is. I agree with Javier and what Jada was saying at the beginning, with all these hierarchies that we have in Puerto Rico, even though we reject the idea that anti-Black racism exists in Puerto Rico, and we don't recognize that the existence of racism in Puerto Rico. So we experience, as you were saying, colonialism, racism, sexism, and all this ism. I remember after Hurricane Irma first, and then Maria, when Donald Trump went to Puerto Rico and showed us with towel paper, and then we had the earthquakes, and now the pandemic. So it's one, you know, we what else we were going to survive in this archipelago, you know? So it is the questions that Javier mentioned are so important. This is something that I ask my students: when you are traveling, what do you want to experience? What do you want? You want to exchange knowledge with people, or you want to, you know, only have fun with people, or I'm saying I'm there and I'm helping the economy of the people there? Because this is the rhetoric of the government of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is open for business for whom? And who can, when at the beginning of the pandemic with this, the quédate en casa, stay at home, who can stay at home? And I remember the Department of Health, the anuncios, the ads for to prevent coronavirus, they use images of Black people as the people with the virus, a Black woman as a cashier. Who can stay at home if you have to go to work? And when they decided to stop people, or, you know, to be more rude or violent with the measures for control the virus, they went against the poor people, the impoverished people in Puerto Rico, because we have the bad part every time, you know, with everything. So this also make me think about pobreza in Puerto Rico, poverty in Puerto Rico. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of anti-racist leaders and activists in Puerto Rico were asking the Department of Education to open the comedores. I don't know how to say that in English. The
food banks.
The food banks in the schools, because there are a lot of people, students, that they only have one hot food meal.
Or rather cafeteria, sorry.
At the cafeteria, exactly. So they and what this was an issue in Puerto Rico because there's a lot of students in the impoverished areas in Puerto Rico, non-white Puerto Ricans, because some people say that we are not black, so non-white Puerto Ricans in these areas that doesn't have meals. So they have to open schools to give them a meal for at least one meal a day. So when we think about tourism, and this question is so important because if you are traveling to Puerto Rico for what? And if you are traveling, are you putting in risk Puerto Ricans? Do you know that we are a colony? Do you know that we don't have the same health system? Do you know that there's a lot of people, impoverished people in Puerto Rico? Do you know, it's a lot of questions. And again, what I was saying at the beginning, this is something that is part of the colonialism, this system of oppression and power. And even though that I obviously I'm not agree with racism, but when people travel to Puerto Rico, also Black people traveling to Puerto Rico is part of the system that we don't study in the United States about Puerto Rico. We don't know. Sometimes I say Puerto Rico, Costa Rica. No, Puerto Rico, and people don't know about the Junta de Control Fiscal. We don't have power for nothing in Puerto Rico. So, and we are in 21st century. So it's so important to ask this question when you are traveling to wherever. I think the questions that Javier mentioned and you put in the slide are so important that everybody needs to ask these questions while traveling.
Thank you. And I want to get Jada in here. I want to highlight a quote from your article. I mean, I enjoyed reading your article and everyone should read it. All of the articles, all of the content that's coming out from this talented panel. And when you went to Puerto Rico, you said that on the trip, you experienced the dynamism of kinship. It was sudden in its formation, explosive in its impact, and warm in its connection. Ultimately, it has no criteria that could contain it. It was not on the basis of blood or a shared spoken language. It was on the basis of care and compassion. And specifically, you said on the trip, connection, and this, I have to highlight, you took this trip pre-pandemic, just so that we are clear on that. The connection became the mode of relation. And going to the slide, in the middle, here we have a Instagram page, where it's a Puerto Rican Instagram page. And I think, what is it? Charco PR, Brinca, Charco PR. There are a lot of countries in the global South creating these work from paradise schemes. I saw I think they were doing it in Barbados. I think, and actually Trinidad was one of those countries that shut down from the beginning. And they were like, nope, we full up, party done, nobody coming through, no. And so specifically to what you said on the basis of care and compassion, and what Javier and Bárbara mentioned, that sure, as a US citizen, there is a level of privilege and access and an alignment with the white supremacist pathological social order that, hey, I'm getting a little VIP treatment here. Let me have nice things, right? Black joy, #blessed. At what point do we interrogate those notions?
I think we should be interrogating them even if it wasn't a pandemic, but I think it still has implications to tourism, has implications even if it wasn't. But especially since there is one now, I think like this would be a perfect time to at least ask, like, what are my motives? Why am I doing this? I think though that I don't want to be cynical, but I do want to think like whether it's realistic, whether I think people will actually be asking these questions is sort of another story where, I just think that a lot of the people that I know who are traveling, like I do know people that I like grew up, went to school with who like work factory jobs or work essential workers in a sense who are also not working from home are still taking trips. And so it brings into focus the ways that the pandemic always sort of highlights or heightens disparities. And so when we're thinking of this pandemic in terms of African Americans, what we see, basically what Javier said, is more people feeling like I now have access to these things that I'm going to take advantage of, because when things sort of go back to normal, I may not have these sort of accesses. And so the focus is truly very narrow, which I think we're, as African Americans, taught to think very narrowly about our social identity from a very young age. What Randy Gill Sadler calls this African American exceptionalism, this idea that African Americans in the States are like representatives of a Black experience. And so I think that now would be a good time to begin questioning the motives of tourism, but whether people will actually begin to do it, I think I'm cynical. I'm cynical.
And I mean, that's valid. There's space for that because, and it's realistic. I know Javier and I have had many discussions about how a lot of our thought process borders on Afro-pessimism, and there's space for that too. All of y'all brought up the point of essential workers, and the division of labor within the Americas, throughout the Americas. You see the racial lines along labor lines. Who is doing the heavy lifting? Who is laboring and versus who is leisuring? Specifically in Panama, any type of heavy labor is done by Black people, and also Indigenous people. But specific to my observations and my lived experiences, you'll have Black men are they're the garbage collectors. They're the construction workers. Javier and I were talking about the quote, cogiendo sol como un negro, or like taking sun like a Black person, because it's Black people who are outside, it's Black people who are doing all of the heavy lifting, essentially. And so to bring up the same slide that I had before we went to you, Jada, and how with the essential workers, and actually, Bárbara, the cartoon or the, I guess it was the government campaign to encourage people to wash their hands, or whatever campaign they thought they were doing. There were instances of that anti-Black campaigning in also in Peru and a couple other places that positioned Black folks as somehow the carriers of COVID. And just in highlighting how labor divisions, how Black people can't really escape in many of our spaces. And this idea of escapism, there's nowhere for a lot of us to escape. And the hard reality is that, for example, in Panama, they had this, they were spreading this belief that if you had more sun, and this was actually the Cuban health department was perpetuating this as well, that because the Caribbean is sunny, it's hot, the virus couldn't survive here. And so you had a lot of that disinformation. You had a lot during this time, you have heightened corruption, you have heightened femicide, you have heightened violence, intimate partner violence. And so, and again, this is and it's not really a question, it's a topic, because this is ongoing conversations. Do you think that people from the US are even interested in those day-to-day realities? And even if those realities affect people that may look like their twin, may look like their cousin, may look like their auntie, their grandma, do people even care?
I think the point you're making about right, looking like your auntie, looking like your grandma, there is always, I mean, so the way that I think about this, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, Blackness as a construction is very contextual, of course. And so Blackness in the States requires certain sort of factors, right? You speak English, you were born here, etc. So when we're thinking of like going to places where people may speak Spanish or may speak French, there's an automatic sort of disconnection where it's like I no longer see you as any sort of relative of mine, right? And even when I went to Puerto Rico, my professor, I asked my professor, I was like, where are the Black people? And she was like, everywhere. And she was like, she said that often when she brings people to Puerto Rico, Black people ask her the same question, where are all the Black people? And she's like, there is a language barrier that makes it hard for us to see us as relatives. And I think that was one of the hardest parts for me as well, because I'm not super fluent. Also, I feel like I had to confront, I think for the first time, right? Like, because I am in this new place where my status as sort of citizen in the United States brings me certain privileges. Also, that I was there on an academic trip where it was paid for by a university. So the ways that universities are structured to sort of support this tourism and colonialism, I feel like it was a certain confrontation that I even had to work through and navigate. And I think I was only able to do that because of my education. So people who are traveling for pleasure or for fun or to escape, I don't think will be thinking about these things or will even see any opportunity for kinship, because the whole, I think, concept of tourism is to go into a place and play around. Like it's a playground made for you that you can go to. And so I'm cynical. I think there are a lot of barriers as African Americans that makes it hard to see kinship across sort of cultural lines.
What are your thoughts on that, Bárbara?
Well, while listening to Jada, I'm thinking, I remember in June the 2nd, when we did a manifestation on Black Lives Matters in Puerto Rico, in the Christian street, La Calle de la Resistencia. And I remember with the megaphone on my hands, looking around, my surroundings and the people who were there. And I'm saying, we're the Black people in this manifestation of Black Lives Matter in Puerto Rico. When one of the organizers of the event, Chariana Ferrer Núñez from La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, took a minute to ask evidently Black people to go in the middle of the manifestation, we were a few people. And there were people saying Black Lives Matter, las vidas negras importan, but where's the Black Lives, ¿dónde están las vidas negras? Where's the Black lives in Puerto Rico? And what you were saying, Jada, regarding the language, so in Puerto Rico, if you go to the touristic areas, you will see mixed race people and some probably not necessarily evidently Black people, well, in the kitchens, doing the like maids and cleaning, etc. But talking with people and tourists in English, look at me, I don't speak English as I wanted to, because I don't have the privilege to go to private schools in Puerto Rico where I was growing up. And I went to the University of Puerto Rico. And even though I went to University of Austin for my PhD, it's still hard for me. And even though I'm a professor at the university in San Francisco State, it's so hard for me. And it's because of the experiences that and the privilege that I don't have, and the experiences that I started traveling while in my PhD because I don't have the money to, and I feel like it's qué bueno que lo hice, because now I have a lot of loans to pay that after graduating with my PhD I wasn't able to travel for leisure or to know other part of the world. So I think that I can add to Javier questions. Where's Black people wherever we went to travel to? Because in Puerto Rico, of course there's Black people, there's a lot of Black people, but in the census we have the imperial instrument, and we have the same census with the same question just translated to Spanish. And in the census 2010, 76% of the population identify themselves as white only, even though that we say we're la gran familia puertorriqueña, we're a mixture of indigenous and Spaniards and Black slaves. This is the rhetoric that we use in Puerto Rico. It's like a mantra, but when you have the census, you just mark, te quedas en blanco. You stay in literally y metafóricamente en blanco in the first cajita, in the first box. So I think that we need to recognize where are the Black people in Puerto Rico, and if they're not, why they are not there, or why they are in the places that they are. So it's another question that I add. And regarding the parentesco, the kinship, again, colonialism make us ignorant. And if we don't know history, and we don't know, for example, how Puerto Ricans in the United States get together with African Americans to fight during the civil rights movement, the work of Pura Belpré in New York, the work of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, but we don't know that neither in Puerto Rico nor in the United States. So we think that we doesn't exist, or we are few Black Puerto Ricans. I remember also when at the beginning of the pandemic and after the assassination of George Floyd, when one of the musicians, Cosculluela, says that we doesn't need to talk about las vidas negras importan, Black Lives Matter, because we are not Africans. We are not this kind of negritos. So this is the rhetoric of the national discourse in Puerto Rico. There's no racism. We don't need to be fighting against Black Lives Matter or against the police brutality in Puerto Rico. In 1980, Adolfina Villanueva was assassinated by the police. And Kilómetro Cero has been documenting all the assassinations of non-white Puerto Ricans during the last time. So George Floyd was killed in the United States, but there's a lot of Black Puerto Ricans killed by the police as well. So we need to this conversation is not just in the academia, it's not just in the United States. We need to bring Puerto Rico to the conversation.
Thank you for that. I think it's interesting. It's specifically interesting when Latin Americans talk about, we're raceless, right? But somehow when to call me negra, which is every day. So essentially, who the Black ones are when it's time to deny resources and access and to target and to over police. Somehow, who the Black ones are, right? Miraculously, right? And so you brought up a really great point about, and you mentioned this earlier, about Black people and this idea of being the forever foreigner. Whether it's that Blackness is foreign, right? Oh, well, like you mentioned, you walking around in your island, you're thought to be from mainland US, you're thought to be from another island, you're thought to be from somewhere else, not here. And the idea of who has access to full citizenship, because we've said that word a few times during this panel. Who gets to enjoy the breadth of citizenship? And as Jada brought up, and I mean, we all have brought it up in terms of how Black North Americans, how African descendants in North America are able to access or not access in some spaces, and then also in some ways abuse access with a blue passport. And the local people who were the locals within Latin America, what we would get to enjoy or not enjoy. And so I mentioned with some of the on the ground realities like corruption, you also have over policing. Panama, for example, was basically a police state for months when it was completely shut down with the quarantine. And I remember there weren't even taxis. And I live about 3 blocks from the supermarket. It was only cops in the street. I was terrified, because number one, the cops are notorious for targeting Black people in general. And of course, machista. And of course, I'm a Black woman walking in the street by myself. Whatever they wanted to do, they could. And they wouldn't care after the fact anyway. I had very little recourse. The only recourse I may have had was because I am also a US citizen. And so I want to bring up the slide where at the top, this is a screenshot from the Afro Resistance Instagram account. We need to talk about the genocide in Brazil and how the COVID-19 pandemic, it's in the middle, is affecting the Brazilian population. And then I have pictures of this one in the front with the green, the pandemic, the conflict in the territories, the pandemic disproportionately affecting Black folks, the ongoing war in Colombia, the displacement of Black folks. You had just a couple months ago, and not even a couple months ago, this is ongoing, but on social media, SOS Buenaventura was the hashtag, and the ongoing structural violence and assassinations, as you brought up with George Floyd, the assassination of Black folks. And so it also brings up the event, and not even events. And I think sometimes language fails in these discussions because it's so much more. You had the search for coffins to bury loved ones in Ecuador. You have migrants who had to leave their host country because they lost their job or they couldn't pay their rent. So they had to go back to Colombia or Venezuela, or they're stuck in transit. In Panama is a central crossing point, the Darien jungle, where you have a lot of Haitians, you have a lot of Africans specifically, and Angolans, you have a lot of Cubans traversing. And so in speaking about these lived realities, really, and this is for everyone, what do you hope for us to, because we always say pa'lante, right? Go forward, right? What is your hope, or what is your recommendation? Because this pandemic is not, because people keep saying after the pandemic or after COVID, right? And I'm like, there is no after COVID. So what are some of the things that COVID has unmasked for some? Because people will say, oh, COVID has exposed a lot of these inequalities. I'm like, a lot of us were living these inequalities. So maybe you realize this. So what are some recommendations or your hope, if you even have it, right? Moving forward. And Javier, you already have your little smile. So I'm gonna throw it to you on that one.
I have so much to say. First of all, Bárbara, you speak English well, and I love it. Te queda en blanco. I love that. I love it. Like, you so much this until it's time to check. You know what? Te queda en blanco. But nonetheless, wow, what do I hope for? As somebody who actually curates travel in all the complicated senses that exist, in trying to navigate being a part of this colonial project that we are. And I have to recognize that in trying to do it in an ethical way, and it takes a lot. I would hope that people go back to those questions that I asked and think about them. Because one thing that has come out of this pandemic, going into these virtual spaces with AfroLatino Travel and Black Austin Tours more specifically, is I have way more non-Black people participating, buying. And I'm often troubled and bothered by the question of, wow, did you start this as a result? Did you start Black Austin Tours as a result of what's happening in the nation with the murders of Black people? That's so insulting to me, because I'm like, if you just went to the website and before you put book now, you would have saw that I started this in 2019. That we were talking about these things before. And truth be told, in both spaces, AfroLatino Travel and Black Austin Tours, 90% of people who have purchased from us have been, first of all, are women. And then of that women, the 98 percentile of Black women. And I'm just being 100% honest. And it has been that way before the pandemic. It has been people intentionally searching out us to help them curate these experiences, to see what, to have a different experience in these places, to get this historical context that you need, to work with community partners, to not have a tour guide who's whitewashed the entire experience, who's working and disrupting these tourism economies, and being real about this situation in your participation in it. So I would hope that people going forward, like engaging in tourism particularly, is to seek out people who are really thinking about communities and forging diaspora in very real ways. And I think what I also say in relation to that, like Bárbara pointed out, in Puerto Rico, they had the Black Lives Matter protest. I think there's something very unique about that. With the point that I'm making, that I'm going to make, I think we have to think about how countries, and Latin America specifically, thrive on the deaths, the murder, the horrible treatment of Black people in the United States. It helps them. It helps them keep Black populations in their countries in very marginalized positions. Because a lot of this mediated imagery that goes out coming from the United States, it serves to, one, try to make people in those places believe you don't have as bad as you think. And two, the general public say, oh no, our Black people don't have problems. That's a United States problem. But meanwhile, Black people in these spaces have been being abused by the state. But they refuse to see it. Like, as a Black person and living in Panama, coming from the United States, I talk about this all the time. I was the center of public display, spectacle, guns in my face by the police on multiple occasions. And people were watching. People were just tuned in. And I couldn't feel that most people saw it was wrong. Because I was un negro otro. And like a woman said, what they told my friend when they pulled us off the bus, we were going to Puerto. I told my homeboy, he was from the States too. And I'm like, hey, bro, look, the police are coming on this bus. They only going to pull Black men off this bus. So get ready. And guess what happens? The police come on the bus. Caballero, ven acá, tú. Bájase de bus. Okay, I get off the bus. And my friend, she's from the United States too. And she's like, what's going on? And she turns to the woman sitting next to her and asks her, why are they doing this? And the woman responds to her, por nuestra seguridad. For our security, they're doing this. Because they look like el maleante. We don't have to be. We look like it. And for the security of everybody, we have to be treated like that so we can make sure everybody continues to have a nice life. But we don't, but people turn a blind eye to it on multiple fronts. But there are people who don't. They might not articulate it the same way as we hear like Black Lives Matter in the United States, but you better believe that parents in Panama, mothers specifically, and fathers, when the police roundup comes and they have toque de queda, the curfew, and they're rounding up those Black boys in the barrio. It's the mother that's running down there and telling you got to let these boys go. That's the mother that's shutting down the streets. Y'all got to let these kids out. What are y'all doing? And I think that is an articulation of being racially conscious because of their racialized experiences, absent of a very specific articulation of saying, yo soy negro o negra, and saying that I want you to protect us the same way that you do everybody else in this country. And we're demanding it. But I think we have to be very intentional. So we've got to give some grace in some of those spaces as well, too, to see those things that don't have a very specific articulation, the way we would like to see them articulate a racialized identity. But I think I would love to see people take that into consideration, the voices and the stories that you don't see, and know that there are people fighting.
Thank you so much for that, Javier, and pointing out the shared struggles when we talk about Black mothers. You don't have to speak a specific language to know what that is. You don't have to speak fluent Spanish to understand that Black bodies are always deemed suspicious. We're always a threat. We're always a problem to have to be snuffed out. I remember, and you always bring up this example. I had my wedding in Cuba, and my husband is a big Black man. He likes the term negron because he's a big Black. He's like, I'm an adult. And it was around 4:30, and my wedding party was all Black folks, and my husband was like, let's go. None of my wedding party knew what he was talking about, what he was referring to, but everybody took their stuff and left. And I was looking for my grandma. I'm like, where's Abuelita? She was on the top of that hill. She's 80-year-old Black woman. She knows what time it is, And hello, and I'm all arrogant, like, oh, let me go find my abuelita. Let me find my grandma. She was like, I'm out of here, girl. And so the reason is that around that time, and this is why my husband says that the police come and practice on the Black folks, on the Black Cubans that go to that beach, because we were at a local beach. And we didn't have to explain how, why, who, what, where, when, nothing. People ran out the water, putting on their little, shawl or whatever, because they're like, oh, okay, I know, the whole running joke, when one Black person is running, everybody else runs. And so this is, we talk about diasporic and our shared struggles. We know what time it is. And so I wanted to get and also leave your questions in the comments for the Q&A section, which will be in a couple minutes. But I wanted to get your thoughts, Jada and Bárbara.
Yeah, I think my hope is related to kind of what you were just discussing, because when I was there were people who really made my experience, like as I talked about in the article, like really made my experience very welcoming, but they were all a part of the program that we were in, right? And so navigating other spaces was very different. Like we were in Adjuntas, we went to San Juan towards the end, and I was hyper visible, like as a Black person. And so I think that what I would hope is a confrontation like throughout the diaspora of our own positionalities in a way that allows for what we're basically saying, like this kinship across cultures. Because I think that it was something that I had to learn and navigate. And I literally wrote that article a whole year after I visited, because the experience was just that. It was a lot. It was a lot to navigate. That was my first time ever sort of out of the country, off of the mainland. And so it was a lot to process. And I think that my experience as a Black person there was a particular way because I was Black and because I was from the States. And so I think that my hope would be for more conversation, more dialogue, more understanding, more understanding of each other's histories, of the ways that they intersect. It would be for an actual practice of that sort of kinship politic that I was discussing in the article. That would be my hope.
So for me, my hope is to heal and to Afro-reparar, the Afro-reparations. And I hope that my great nieces and great nephews doesn't have to think about heal. And I also want to add that, for example, Vieques is one of the islands of the archipelago, and is one of the islands most visited by tourists in Puerto Rico. And some people went to San Juan and went to Vieques or Culebra, and that's it. And this is their Puerto Rican vacations. And I remember the first time I went to Vieques, even though I'm from Fajardo, and the chiefs were going from Fajardo to Vieques. The first time I went to Vieques, I was like 18 or 19 years old. I was at the university by that time. I was talking with students. I was in a project with at the university, working with students and literacy, etc., with teachers and students. And I was asking them what are their needs, and the list of needs are a lot. And like 10 or 15 years later, I went back to Vieques with Colectivo ILE, the Colonial and Anti-Racist Collective I'm a member of, and they have the same necessity, the same needs. And today, they still have the same needs. And one of the needs they have is a hospital. In Vieques and Culebra, there's no hospital. There's not a efficient transportation for the people there. So they don't have fresh food to eat. They have, all the basic needs as humans, they need it in Vieques. And a lot of people go there for as tourists, and they don't know. They went to the playas, to the beaches, and they don't know the struggles the Vieques inhabitants are having. So when people ask, what can I do to help? You need to know what are the needs of the people. You need to ask them. I remember after the earthquakes, a brigade of people from other part of the island went with water and food for the people in the south of Puerto Rico, where the earthquakes affect the most. And some people said, we need a hug. We need a place to play for our kids. We don't need more water. We don't need more food. We have plenty of food right now. So I think that we need to ask the people what they need, because sometimes we think the people need something based on our privilege, and people's what can I bring to Puerto Rico to help? I think that we need to continue talking about this, the difficult conversation, the talks. We need to continue talking about this. We need to continue listening, because sometimes I've been talking about racism in Puerto Rico for a long time. And every time I'm in a meeting or a conference or something, the question about reverse racism appears. And but also the woman experience violence. Of course, women experience violence, but Black women experience another layer of violence because we are Black. So sometimes we need people to hurt us and not diminish our experiences because you don't have the experience. So I think that we need to be listening and understanding. And I don't have the responsibility to teach you about racism. You need the responsibility to learn about white privilege, about your positionality, about racism, because sometimes we are talking about these topics from our corazón, our heart, from our pain. It's painful to continue talking about these and trying to heal as well. So I think that people need to understand that our experiences are historically. And even though we have, evolucionamos, but we're still suffering a different, in a different way, racism and genocide and gentrification. So I think that we need to listen. And this is my hope, to heal and to bring another anti-racist world for my people in the diaspora and in Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Bárbara. And you're talking specifically about the shared struggles and the forging toward global Black liberation. And in what you said about bringing, or rather in collaboration with the community, and understanding, researching, seeking out the folks on the ground already doing what they need to be doing, because it's life or death in many of our spaces. And what I often say to people who say, how can I help? I say a little bit in jest, but not really. Open your purse. If you have the means and the access, open your purse and seek out the organizations already organizing, already doing that work, because who knows the needs of the community better than the community? And there are a lot of mutual aid efforts happening currently. At AfroLatino Travel, we're raising money for a Black youth soccer league to get kids signed up to play soccer in a intentionally marginalized neighborhood in Panama City, in Gurundu. And the founders, two young Black Panamanian men, they've been organizing for years around this, years. And when we were traveling, we had folks bringing, for example, we have a Black doll program where we tell folks to bring dolls with them, because in a lot of places you can't access Black dolls. There's no Black dolls in countries where whites are the minority. And so also with supplies, and I think someone brought up, if we do travel, bring supplies. And the thing is that, I mean, we're not endorsing traveling. But at the same time, if in the future you do travel, I think it's also the notion that if you're doing it in good faith, because we end up having people who want to take pictures with them, donating things, who want to go into schools. I'm completely against that. Go to the school in your neighborhood and see if they let you in without you being kin to somebody in that school. It's not happening. And so I implore and I invite folks to, if you're going to be a mutual aid and in community, then be in community. It's not up to you to take a picture of yourself handing a child a pencil for Instagram. Why are you putting a strange child on your Instagram anyway? Would you like that for your child? And so in thinking again, in treating people how you would like to be treated, right? And so I would like to go to some of if we have questions or comments. I do want to point out one of the comments that jumped out at me because I was thinking this. Casey says, one does not necessarily have to attend university to learn about the African diaspora. All you have to do is read and interact with other nationalities in your local area. Sure, I agree with that. And at the same time, there are some communities that are very insulated, isolated. I mean, I'm from New York, and people, we don't even leave our borough, but some people don't even leave their block for a lot of their lives. And so absolutely, yes. You don't have to attain a university degree to understand the diaspora, but we all have our point of access, right? Our point of understandings. Because, for example, a lot of Black Latin Americans can talk about US freedom fighters, but how many Black North Americans can name any Black Latin American freedom fighters? Maybe beyond Arturo Schomburg, which a lot of people, as Bárbara mentioned, a lot of people may not even know he's Puerto Rican. And so I would like to go, do we have any comments or questions from the audience? And thank y'all for your very thoughtful answers and responses and your thoughts. Morel, shout out to Brittany. How or where do you think we should start so that the African diaspora can come together and recognize each other? And that is for any of you. But my input was that I don't think we have to start. We have been. That's just through documented history and even undocumented history, because that is not the only way to transmit history. I think we have always been in communication with one another. And what do you, our lovely panelists, think?
Somebody has to say something.
I mean, I guess it's you. I mean, you unmuted and everything.
I thought Jada wanted to say something. So
I mean, I actually was about to say something about the previous comment. So I was like, okay. Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was gonna just move on, but I was thinking about the previous comment because I felt like it was sort of related to what I was saying about me not learning the term diaspora until I was a junior in college. And I was just thinking about like Dash said, like basically, yes, it's true that you can read and interact with other nationalities, but the reality that I live is that you go to public school. If you finish, if you are not kicked out, if it does not close down, if they do not turn it into a shopping mall. And then pretty much from there, a lot of people go to work in factories, CNA work, very technical things, trades or et cetera. And so the education sort of stops, and then you live in your own sort of insular circle and you operate based on the education that you received if you finished from K through 12. And so I just wanted to make that point that a lot of the people that I do know and where I do come from, it's a working class. And so it is not necessarily about reading and researching and finding these things. And so I think that is one barrier in itself to sort of having these transcultural conversations, is that the day-to-day labor, my grandma is like 70 something and she still cleans white people's homes and she is illiterate. So I am literally a first generation college student who comes from Black sharecroppers who cannot read. So the question, and I'm from Alabama and it's like 2021. So I'm like, the question of, oh, you just need to read and interact. It's a very different experience living it and knowing people. So there is a certain privilege that I have by going to college, which equips me for this very conversation, that if I were to ask certain people, like I did share with like my people that this was going on, but are they going to come? This is so out of their element, right? Like something like this is so out of the element for people that I know and that I interact with and the people that I come from. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the ignorance is very structural. Like it's not it's not that easy to bypass because it is very intentional, right?
Yeah, and I'll kind of continue off of that just a bit. And I agree 1000% what Jada said, because myself, my mother is African American. I'm raised in Texas. My dad is a Black Panamanian, but I'm raised here in the U.S. South. And it's what Jada mentioned. It speaks to the structural, intentional violence and these colonial projects that have people in their respective locales thinking very narrow things and not having that broad exposure. And and I just want to echo that. And I'm so glad that you addressed that question, because that needs to be said. And I think it can help us better understand how even in an inequitable space that we have as Black people in diaspora, that even though you're in the United States does not inherently mean that you're going to live better than a Black person somewhere outside of the United States, because inequality is fluid. Anti-Blackness is fluid. Jada should not have to go to the university to have access to this information, but it speaks to the same agricultural system that keep Black people tied to the land, like my family picking cotton in Texas. I'm the first person in my family to not pick cotton. And I'm born in 1987.
Let me interject you, and also the first doctor. No, I want to highlight that. Shout out. No, look, because you're not going to say it. I mean, I'm proud of you, but I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah. And on that point, I defended my Ph.D, my dissertation this Tuesday, and my mother was reflecting on that. And that was the first thing that came out of her mouth. She said, we come from a sharecropping family, and this is what we did. And for me, it's like, because on my dad's side, we were on the Panama Canal, dying. And I'm the first one in my family not to have a hand touching and building or working that Panama Canal. So for me, the sharecropping system in the United States is no different from that U.S.-controlled Panama Canal zone where my West Indian ancestors went and died to make this world more accessible. And I think those are things we have to have. We have to keep in. But I don't want to say anything else, but I really thank you so much, Jada, for bringing that up. It's intentional. And I'm glad you were able to do this and share with your community. And I agree. We don't know if they're going to come, but we got to keep trying, though. We got to keep trying.
Thank you, Javier. And I want to end with this question, and maybe Bárbara can help. And I think this is related. If not, let me know. I currently live in Puerto Rico and never really know how to break through the barrier when seen as or called a gringa. I do see Afro-Boricuas as kin, but I'm like, can I at least be called a Yankee? Any advice for that? Before we get to you real fast, it's funny because in Panama we say Yankee too, and there's this history of Yankee go home. And I would say it like on my Twitter or something, and I'm like, Black Latin Americans we don't need Yankees to tell us that we're Black. And some people take offense to that word, Yankee. And my mother's like, what? We've been calling y'all Yankee for generations. What are you talking about? And so it's just that's interesting. And the thing is that for me, and with us doing or previously doing tours, and we bring African Americans to, for example, Cuba, Peru, Puerto Rico, Panama, there was always a gravitation. It was never any pretense. Like, for example, my partner speaks no English, but he would be for hours talking to, like, for example, Black men in France about, I don't know how they were communicating because nobody was translating for them. But I'm like, okay, go off. But what do you think?
So this is a good question because in Puerto Rico, at least for me, gringa and yankee are derogatory. That a lot of people use that words in a bad way to refer to United people from the United States. So I don't know why somebody wants to be called Yankee, because this has a story of the colonialism. So I think that in Puerto Rico, people are so welcoming, specifically with tourist people and white people in general. So it's like, if you are going to Puerto Rico, people will try to speak you in English, even though they, as you were mentioned, your husband trying to speaking with somebody in another language. I remember being in other parts of in Europe, and the people were speaking Portuguese, Italian, or French, and you have to deal with that if you don't understand. But in Puerto Rico, this is not the case. People will try to speak to you in English to make you feel comfortable and welcoming. And so, to be, and I think that if you want to be respected or recognized as part of the Puerto Rican community, you need to be humble, and you need to listen and to understand our circumstances and to understand your privilege. And as I was saying before, not to be like the savior or the person that are going to give you, things, this comes to my mind, the idea of the anthropologists that went to the more far away and more exotic quote unquote places to give people medicines, but then they don't have these resources. So what can we do with that? So I think that the best way to feel part of is to listen to the communities, and as you were saying, to see the organizations that are there. And if you are asking, for example, for a workshop or a conference to understand racism in Puerto Rico, pay the people for the job they are doing. And don't think that we are going to teach you how to perform or how to be a good Yankee or gringo in Puerto Rico.
And thank you for that. We're gonna close out. I just want to say you just might have to eat that. That's what it is. I mean, I've been with my partner for over 6 years. They still call me Yuma in Cuba. And the thing is, it's true. I'm a foreigner. I can't change that. So we just have to accept that. And the thing is that Black folks will accept you wherever you're coming from. And so you're just gonna have to eat that. That's what it is. That's the reality. And like Bárbara said, and this is what my partner says. He's like, the foreigners always think they're Santa Claus, giving out all these things. Who you? Who are you? And so, in just knowing that within Kinship, we also have to stay in our lane, right? And sometimes we just gonna have to eat certain things, right? And that's the way it goes. That's life, as my grandmother says. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for watching. Thank you to the Caribbean Culture Center and African Diaspora Institute, Regina, Kat, and all of the folks that it took to produce this. This was wonderful, and we keep the conversation going. Pa'lante.